I'm Brad Wolf, and welcome to Dire Den. This is part 2 in our How to Build a Sandbox series. And instead of being a scripted video, this series is just me and my DM notes, and you get to see how I work. So what we did in the first video is show you my campaign handout that I give players before session 0, and then I planned session 0. And then I started to get into the campaign building process. But there's so much content there that wouldn't all fit in one video, so you're going to get like 5 or 6 maybe. We'll see. The other thing you need to know is I'm combining 4 adventures to make this sandbox. And the faction I'm working on in this video is the faction that crosses over between Dragon of Icespire Peak and the Forge of Fury. Taking those 2 adventures, which both contain Orcs and Ogres, and combining them into one faction to create a theme that kind of transcends those 2 adventures and ties them together and makes them all fit in the same region and in the same adventure because they're all one big faction of orcs and ogres and Talos worshipping priests. So let's not waste any time. We'll just dive right in. You'll see where I'm going with this. And now let's take a look at the next step, which is the 4 feuding factions. And I know this is where a lot of you have been very interested and have a lot of questions, so I'm going to spend a little time here today. The first thing I did was just copy and paste the Ogre King faction from my factions video, because I figured that was just a simple and easy way to start. Because there's an ogre who's leading a tribe of orcs in the Fury Forge adventure, and there's a tribe of orcs in the Dragon of Icespire Peak adventure. So this faction represents the orcs from Dragon of Icespire Peak, plus the orcs and the Ogre King from Forge of Fury. Fury Forge. Forge of Fury? What's it called? I always get that one mixed up. The Forge of Fury. There you go. Now, what I'm going to do now is just edit this a little bit. So, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the Orc Eye of Grumsh as the elite choice for the orcs. That's because the orcs in Icespire Peak don't worship Grumsh. Instead, they worship Talos, the thunder god. So I'm changing this from the Orc Eye of Grumsh to the Anchorites of Talos. Did I spell that right? There's an H in there. There, the Anchorites of Talos. And we don't need this many ogres, so I'm going to drop the Battering Ram Ogre and the Hoda Ogre and the Oni, because we got a different leader that we're going to put in there. And we're going to add to our brutes the Orog Orc, because there's a few Orogs in the 2 adventures that we're drawing this out of. And then we're going to name our Ogre King, because that's the name he has in Forge of Fury. And then I'm going to replace my Orc Priest with a character from Dragon of Icespire Peak named Yargath, who is also an Orc Priest. He's just a different stat block. Now, in the actual adventure, there's a number of twig blights that show up that kind of follow along like servants to these Anchorites of Talos. But I'm not going to use twig blights because there are blights in the Sunless Citadel adventure. So I want to use something different. Because the blights work for the villain in the Sunless Citadel, I want to have a different set of minions for these Anchorites of Talos. So I'm going to give them Mephits, because Mephits are little elementals, and these Anchorites of Talos have storm-themed powers. So they'll probably have like dust Mephits and steam Mephits and ice Mephits that kind of fit that thunderstorm kind of theme. And now we needed another elite, and the other elites we have are the Ogre Bolt Launcher, so that's a ranged attack elite. And then we have the Spellcaster Controller with our Anchorites of Talos. So we really need a stealthy elite, which this faction doesn't really have, but if I'm continuing to go with the kind of thunderstorm theme of these priests and their worship of Talos, I can go with an Invisible Stalker, because they are actually, invisible, there we go, stalker. Because invisible stalkers are technically air elementals. So it'd basically be like these priests summoning an intelligent collection of air to go spy on people. I think that's kind of cool and fits the theme. And lastly, I'm going to have another orc war chief, because I had to come up with my own plot for Leland, because there is no specific quest in any of the 4 adventures for the town of Leland. So I stole the idea of Fistful of Dollars, where 2 gangs move into town and the 2 gangs are fighting over control of the town. So these 2 orc war chiefs have come to town with a tribe of their own, and they're kind of feuding over who's going to rule the town. But in order to do that, I need some orc names. So I'm going to come over here to Fantasy Name Generator, where I've pulled up orc names. And right off the bat, I love this one right here, Snaglak. So I'm going to copy that, come over here, and this is Orc Chief Snaglak. Let's see, I change the font to make that match. Orc Chief Snaglak. And now we need another one, so let's come back over here and get a new list. Let's see. Not really feeling any of those. Let me try another one. Zobub. What if we mix these two? We'll take the Zogbub. I like Zogbub. So I'll take the Zog from this one and the Bub from that one, and we get Orc Chief Zogbub. So we have Zogbub and Snaglak fighting over control of Leland. I like that. I'm good with that. And that basically finishes this faction off. So let me say something about using these factions. When you're using pre-made adventures, you don't necessarily have to go to this much work to create these factions, but this is just how I build a campaign. If you're using pre-made adventures, they tell you exactly which monsters are in which rooms of which dungeon. But when you're running the sandbox, you're not sure if the players are going to get to a location at the appropriate level. So if you need to adjust the difficulty, then that's where these faction blocks come in. So you can grab something off your prepared list and add it to the dungeon that you're running in order to dial up the difficulty level. For example, my players might not get to Forge of Fury until their 6th or 7th level, because there's going to be so much to do in this sandbox. So if they get there at that high level, I'm going to want to add some Ogre Chain Brutes or some Orogs or some Ogre Bolt Launchers to mix up the combats and make them more challenging. So to help you in building your own factions, let me elaborate on the different types of monster roles. So first of all, we have the grunts, and they're going to be the backbone of the faction's forces. So think of them like generic troops in a war game. So if you ever played Warhammer 40,000, the Space Marine is your basic trooper, and they make up what are called tactical squads. And that is typically the backbone of your force. Then you have your specialized Marines that are your commanders, your assault troops, your heavy weapon troops. So we're using that same kind of formula here. So when you're filling out your faction stat blocks, you're looking for challenge rating 1/4 and 1/2 monsters to put in your grunts. But you can also have different types of grunts to fit the theme, like I've done here with the Mephits. So in this faction, the Mephits fit the elemental theme of these orcs who worship the god Talos. But they also provide a variety of different interesting attacks, which goes along well with our straightforward orc troops. But even though our orcs are pretty straightforward, they have a ranged attack that's just as strong as their melee attack. And that allows for a decent variety on the battlefield. And our half-ogres are almost identical to the orcs because they have both the melee attack and the javelin throw ranged attack. But they could also be flavored in different directions because you could use them as literal half-ogres, or you could just have them be bigger, badder orcs and use the same stat block. Now you might be wondering why the half-ogre is challenge rating 1, which is higher than what I recommended for the grunts. And that's because I mainly expect the Fury Forge adventure to be towards the end of the campaign. I'm not really expecting the players to interact with this faction until a challenge rating 1 monster would actually qualify as a grunt. But if they do interact with this faction sooner rather than later, there are 6 different types of Mephits, and that's plenty of variety to use at lower levels. Next is our brutes, and I feel like the name says it all here. You want a monster who can hit hard and take hits. So that means solid damage output and a high armor class or high hit points. Think of these as like the monster versions of your fighters and your barbarians. And there's plenty to choose from in the monster manual because 5th edition doesn't do a really great job of making interesting monsters. So a lot of the monsters are just big bags of hit points. But tactically, what you want to do is use the brutes to soak up attacks. So if you have a brute in your encounter, you can use a brute as a meat shield for an elite or a leader. You can also intentionally move a brute first to take up an opportunity attack. Then after the player expends their opportunity attack, your elite can maneuver out of combat without risk of taking extra damage. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do some encounter design around battlefield tactics. I would be happy to make some videos on that. Next we have the elite category, and it does a lot of heavy lifting. Because remember, these monster rolls come from 4th edition, and 4th edition actually had 7 different rolls. So the elites cover 3 in 1. And we have an example of each one in this faction. The Ogre Bolt Launcher serves as our skirmisher. This particular monster is not good at hit and run tactics, but it's good at kiting because it has a 40-foot move speed and a nasty range attack. And this monster gets even nastier when there's large enough chunks of terrain for it to take cover behind. Next we have our Anchorites of Talos, and they serve the controller function, and that's because they are spellcasters. But any monster with an area effect spell or a charm ability can make a good controller. The last role we have is the Assassin, also called the Lurker. And for this faction, we're using the Invisible Stalker. But think of the Lurker role like the Rogue. You want the potential of surprise and the ability to do a lot of damage, or tie up a player in a one-on-one combat and keep them away from the objective. And last we have our leaders, but before we get to them, let's talk a little bit about challenge rating. And you can see that I put the challenge ratings in the chart here. The only thing that's significantly important is that your brutes and elites are a higher challenge rating than your grunts. That's mostly because your grunts are going to be attacking in packs. And typically you want your leaders to have the highest challenge rating because they're the big bads, the more powerful creatures. But occasionally you might have an elite who's higher challenge rating than your leaders, but that would usually be a monster that's not very intelligent, so it might be more powerful than the leader, but it's not smart enough to get out from under the control of the leader. What's really most important about the leaders is they reinforce the flavor of the faction, which is why Yargath is one of the leaders, as he is also an Anchorite of Talos. Then the rest of the leaders in this faction are just bigger, nastier brutes, because that's the overall theme of this faction. They're just a force of nature. There's also a sympathetic story behind these brutish barbarians. They have been displaced from their home, and that provides an interesting juxtaposition. This faction presents as very brutal and violent, but ultimately they're under the manipulation of their religion, which they have turned to in a time of trouble because a dragon has displaced them from their home. So that's a really long way to say that your leaders are one of the driving forces for the narrative of the campaign. Now, if you have more questions about factions, make sure you ask them in the comments below, because I have 3 more factions to cover during this campaign prep process, and I can always work the answers to those questions into future videos. But definitely subscribe and ring that notification bell so you can stay up to date on this series. And if you really enjoy this series, I can continue it throughout the rest of the campaign. And it can be a combination of campaign report, session prep, and lessons learned. I think this could be a really fun side project for this channel. But don't worry, I'll still continue with general running the game style content also. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time on the Dire Den.